Welcome everybody to this webinar on the US elections 2020 and the future of the world order. Um, my name is Radhika Desai and I'm the convener of a small informal discussion group called the International Manifesto Group, and I'm located in Winnipeg in Manitoba in Canada. Just a couple of words before we start about the group. So we started discussing the evolving political and geopolitical economy of the world order and its national and regional components at the beginning of the pandemic. And we have members around the world from North America to Japan and everything in between. And we try to meet fortnightly. Of course, we also make parts of our meeting. We have recently decided to hold more open events as well, like this one. This is our first one, and we will also be putting on the little website that we have created for the International Manifesto Group on the website of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. So we will put parts of our discussion which are public on there for people to see, because we feel that very often they are very rich. We will be publishing them there in coming days. Some of them are already up there. So, okay, we'll get this meeting started. We have a very simple procedure. We have simply invited everybody who wishes to join to simply join the meeting. And there will be some speakers followed by a question and answer session. We will begin in the order of the panel, in the order in which the panelists are listed, with one exception. I had put John Ross first because I felt that the China element was very important, but he and I have just finished another meeting, or at least I left another meeting a little bit earlier. He's just finishing it and he'll be joining us as soon as he's done. So we will take him when he comes. But otherwise, we will simply start our meeting so we leave him aside, and we will begin with Oleg. Oleg, I hope that's okay with you. We will start with you whenever you are ready, but give me a couple of minutes. Okay, so that's the order. For Kate Hudson, who has another meeting today, we have a short recorded set of reflections, and we had asked her specifically to reflect on the nuclear angle, so nuclear weapons and nuclear war angle, because she's the chairperson of the CND. So each speaker will focus on the effects of the aftermath, I should say, rather than the results, the aftermath of the US elections for their part of the country, but also inevitably, of course, they will be reflecting a little bit on the character of the election, the results, and what this says about the United States, its politics, its society, its economy, etc., and its place in the world. Okay, so and after all the presentations are done, we will go to questions. Each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes. The idea is to keep the presentations short so that all the speakers focus on what's most important, and then we will move to questions and answers where other points may be brought out. In the question and answer session, I would only request that you please keep your questions brief and sharp and to the point. And if you wish to ask questions, since there are now many people, we have 36 people right now, more will probably be joining. So please use the raise hand function. If you go to participants, you will see all the participants in the meeting, and at the bottom, you will have an option to raise your hand, and that way I'll be able to see who would like to speak, and I will keep a speakers list. And finally, I have Brendan here, who will be assisting me by monitoring the chat. If people would prefer to place questions in the chat rather than posing them verbally in person, as it were, please feel free to do that as well. We will monitor the chat and bring on those questions. So without further ado, then, oh yes, please, one further thing. Please note that we are recording this event, and we will be putting it on the Manifesto Group website later on, and on its YouTube channel for people who may want to watch later. So, okay, so So we will begin then with Oleg Barabanov. Oleg Barabanov is program director of the Valdai Discussion Club, which is kind of like um, a kind of Council of Foreign Affairs, a Russian counterpart of the Council on Foreign Affairs, and academic director of the European Studies Institute at the GIMO University, the famous diplomatic university in Russia. And some of you may have seen him a week or two ago giving a really absorbing lecture on the situation, the pandemic situation in Russia. So I will ask him to begin with his remarks. Oleg.
Thank you, Radhika. Good day, everybody. And well, frankly speaking, is not much to say about the Russian reaction because it was almost totally at the official level pro-Trump. Because the official position was that the victory of Joe Biden would be a catastrophe for the Russia-U.S. relations taken into the framework of the Kremlin regime. And in that sense, all the economic pressure on Russia, all sanctions that we are already facing, to all this, there will be some new addition on the human rights issue. Because Trump was not really active on a human rights agenda in Russia and so on. And you can see everybody a very weak reaction of the current US administration on the case of poisoning of Alexei Navalny, one of the Russian opposition leaders, with Novichok and so on.
Yeah, just 1 second, Oleg. May I please request everyone to mute themselves except Oleg, because there's some noises are coming through and Oleg's presentation is being disturbed. Okay, so please mute yourselves until you need to speak. Okay, go ahead, Oleg.
Yeah, and in that sense, so all the expectations were a bit pessimistic because there was some polls in favor for Biden, plus 10%, plus 15%, and so on. We all have seen these polls before the election day. And then there was a bit surprising hope that when Trump was started not to win, but to possibly win in the early morning after the election night. And there was in the Russian social media, in the Russian segment of Facebook and so on, there was a huge optimistic approach. In fact, I've seen many prominent Russian political scientists, politicians, behaving as themselves as in a football match. They were clearly in favor for Trump and expecting his victory. After that, the situation has changed. Joe Biden started to receive more and more votes. And in that sense, the main approach in Russia, in the official pro-Kremlin circles, in the official pro-Kremlin political analysts circles and so on, was to switch to focus on presumed falsifications. And it was interesting that not only pro-Kremlin actors were focused on the falsifications and so on, but also some Russian opposition liberals were focused on this matter as well, because some of presumed falsifications knew thousands of votes in the last moment and so on. They were quite similar to some Russian electoral falsifications. And in fact, we had regional elections a few years ago in Vladivostok, in the far east of Russia, in the Pacific coast. when there was the opposition communist candidate leading up to 95% of votes counted. And then in the last 5% of voters, he was overcome by the pro-Kremlin incumbent candidate. So many, unfortunately, not only pro-Kremlin, but I still insist, many opposition experts in Russia were focused on this visual similarity between Russian falsifications and what could be presumed falsifications as they were in the case of American elections. Okay, I understand all this story with postal vote, with late counting of postal votes. I don't insist absolutely on the fact of the falsifications. I'm just explaining the Russian reaction. And so now there is a kind of pessimism, but many pro-Kremlin experts are predicting chaos for the United States in the future, and in that sense, the logic that the Russian position was in favor of the chaos in America, in the favor of future disorder in America after the elections is quite right. And just to finish, maybe for the plus side, some people now started to think what could be positive for the Russian regime after Biden's victory. So one, the first obvious thing that the negotiations on nuclear armaments, on missiles, will continue more, let's say, positively with Joe Biden, and existing treaty on strategic nuclear weapons could be re-elaborated with Biden administration much better than with possible second Trump administration. Another thing that now people started to say that, okay, but Joe Biden knows Russian politics quite well. He was the vice president for 8 years. He knows the people, he knows the limitations of the Russian politics. So in that sense, it could be more realistic in his approach towards Russia. So now there is not, for the moment, a clear position, but there are some those things that I've mentioned. But absolutely officially, the foreign ministry and the presidential spokesman, they said that Russia is ready to work with both, either with Biden or with Trump, who will be elected, but this is the formal diplomatic phrase that every diplomatic spokesperson will raise. So that's for short.
Thank you so much, Alek. Okay, if John is willing to go now, can we have John Ross, please?
Yeah, sure. Remind me of the speaking time, Radhika.
7 minutes, please.
7 minutes. I've been chairing another event, so I've been tied up. Right, okay. I think there is, I'm not surprised by the outcome of the election in the United States. It would have been nice to see Trump got less votes, but I think that Biden was going to win. As I'm dealing particularly with the situation in China, I think, however, there was in China, I'm absolutely sure in China, there was the alternative opinion that they thought that Trump would win. And I think there was several reasons. Firstly, there is a group of people there are forces in China who actively support Trump on the grounds that he disorganizes the West. They're not supporting him because they endorse him from a right-wing point of view. They're endorsing him from the point of view they believe that Biden wishes to create a broad united front against China, which is, in my opinion, is absolutely correct. and that Trump has a disorganizing effect on the West. Okay, if we leave that on one side, I think that the other factor in this misjudgment in the situation is that they're used to looking at the situation as China and the United States, as though the United States is an undifferentiated type of entity. And they didn't see, therefore, the political contradictions which existed amongst this. I know this very accurately, not merely because I read the Chinese social media and the Chinese social press every day, but I'm, sorry, just to be objective, I'm a rather popular author in China. I have a million followers on Weibo, for example, and normally the audience is in general supportive of the views. But in the case, I wrote an article which basically predicted the victory of Biden, and I would say 70% of the comments opposed this or disagreed with it and believed that Trump was going to win. If we look at the present situation, however, it is my view of what is the difference in this. I think that the calculation of Obama is that if it is only I'll call Obama Biden, that this analysis is, if it is only a confrontation between the United States and China, from their point of view, they believe it is not at all certain that the United States will win, despite all the bluff that goes on. And if you look merely at the immediate thing, China gained enormously economically on the United States following the 2008 financial crisis. And if you look at the projections of the IMF for the COVID situation, they are really, truly remarkable. I'm not necessarily a great fan of the IMF's accuracy, although I must have, it has actually eliminated a considerable amount of its pro-US optimism bias in its forecast, to give it its due. So it's not become so inaccurate. It projects that in 2020 and 2021, 60% of world economic growth will take place in China. Not merely over 50%, 60% of world economic growth in China. And it estimates that 3% will take place in the United States. And actually, its last predictions were too optimistic for the US. This is a tremendous shift in the economic relation of forces. You can see it very clearly in the situation in the United States. I don't have time to go into the China new 5-year plan. The meeting of the Central Committee, just the Communist Party just discussed. In my opinion, actually, it's a very impressive document. It's the guidelines for it. The core to it is the concept of dual circulation, in which domestic circulation will dominate. Now, why does it use the word circulation? Because this is a much broader concept than simply the question of boosting domestic demand. It puts forward in very classical Marxist terms that it determines that the three chief elements of circulation, as they put it, is production, distribution, and consumption. Therefore, it's not looking merely to boost the demand within the economy. Really, its analysis is that China will have to rely on domestic demand because it doesn't mention the United States by name, but it's obvious. A number of countries are turning against globalization. And also what they're attempting to engage in is a technological blockade of China. A number of people I know in the United States, and I agree with this, think that the tactics chosen by Trump were extremely stupid in order to confront China. By imposing tariffs, what Trump did was he took on China on the area where it's strongest, which is medium technology, highly competitive price value, and he attacked China on its strongest point. It's not a good tactics in a war to attack your enemy on its strongest point. Instead, the attack should have been concentrated in this analysis on where the United States maintains an advantage, which is in high technology. Therefore, the people who are very enthusiastic about the attack on WeChat or Huawei or TikTok are also quite critical of Trump's use of tariffs. China sees this as the main threat, and therefore the great emphasis in the plan is the ability to carry out research and development and technology so that any part in the production chain can be replaced that was dependent on globalization. This is, of course, far easier in some areas than it is in other areas. But this is why this term dual circulation is used. I mean, it's very classical Marxist view, and that's why it's not just boosting domestic demand. This is then also, of course, interfits with the international questions, for example, on climate change, on which there is very real emphasis. Xi Jinping was very carefully calculated in his speech at the United Nations, saying that China would achieve peak CO2 emissions before 2030 and would achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. China, which will have to be reflected in the details of the coming 5-year plan, because no quantitative growth rates were announced in this. However, finally, just to conclude on that, nevertheless, although no quantitative growth rates were announced, you can actually work some of them out. Xi Jinping has said that China will at least double its per capita GDP by 2035. This, incidentally, in parity purchasing power terms, will make China's economy about 75% bigger than the economy of the United States in real terms. That would be an implication of that. The implied growth rate that is required to do that is 4.7% a year over the next 15 years. Okay. There is a projection that obviously that this would be faster in the beginning of the period and slow down a little bit later. My honest opinion is actually that China could do a bit better than 4.7%, and I would be confident that the 4.7% will be hit. About probably the only thing I agree with on Steve Bannon on is that the United States only has about 5 years to put a stop to this. After that, it's too late, and I think that is accurate. So therefore, finally to summarize, there will not be any change from the Cold War orientation by Biden, but I expect that there will be a significant change in tactics. That is the Trump America First policy versus the broad anti-China alliance is not a fake dispute. It was not a fake fight between Trump and Biden, but it was not over a fight over whether to have a confrontation with China, but it was only over the question of by what means to have a confrontation with China. I was very impressed. I'm not saying this just so I work in exactly radical last sentences. Right? I don't say nice things about China without believing them. If I think I might not say something which is, if I want to criticize, I might do it in private and not say it, but I don't say things which are praised. And I think that the plans for the 5-year plan are highly impressive, and therefore places China in a good position for this situation. That's very quickly. Excuse me to be rushed.
No worries. And thank you, John. And my mistake, I did not introduce John, but on the other hand, of course, John needs very little introduction, but just for those who may not know, John is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, and he also maintains a fabulous website called learningfromchina.net. So those of you who are interested in his work can also check it out there. Great, thanks a ton, John. Now, our next speaker is Michael Bree. He is a social philosopher at the Institute for Critical Social Analysis at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. And I know from working with him that he is a fantastic writer on all elements of social transformation and politics and so on. And I've requested requested each person here to look after some or the other part of the world or country. And I wanted him to specifically speak to Germany, EU related matters. So, Michael, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. I try to be in time and very brief. The first thesis of mine, it's more impression. If you are now looking on the German TV, it's a little bit crazy because for a long time, for the West German elites and maybe also for a broader part of the population, the US was, maybe with the exception of the Vietnam War, somehow really the city up on the hill. Yeah, an example, outstanding for freedom and so on. And of course, because of the war and so on, the Second World War. And now I see German politicians like our foreign minister Maas and others who start to teach the Americans democracy. This is really funny. It's really funny because we are already famous for teaching a lot of other nations around the world and in Europe how to behave. Now we are teaching, our elites are teaching, we have teached, as you know it, the Greek population how to save money and to run the economy, and now we are teaching the Americans. But this is, on the other hand, of course, a sign on the wall, because it makes clear that the US was for Germany, and I think for a larger part of Europe, somehow the patron after the Second World War, and then enlarged Europe after the end of the Cold War. And the problem with Trump is that this patronage does not work anymore. The second observation I would like to make is that we see that centrist neoliberal politics, even in the US, are breeding a form of authoritarian, close to fascist rule, neglecting democracy, neglecting basic liberal rules. And we must remind ourselves that Clinton made Bush Jr. possible, and all was happened after September 11th, and then Obama, and Trump is totally right. Trump was made possible by Obama. Yeah, he made Trump possible. So we should know all this, and we must also realize, and this I think was the German audience was more or less stunned by the electoral results, because it proved the strength of a Trump-led Republican Party. This type of Trumpism proved to be very, very strong, with long-lasting effects. And this is not a lesson the German elites like to hear. The third lesson, I think, for us, we are now, of course, facing on the Biden-Trump competition and so on, but I'm representing the Left Foundation in Germany. We have to realize the fatal weakness of the left. Nobody is speaking about the left in the US. We have seen the inability of Corbyn to win the elections in Great Britain and so on. And I would like to show you, moment, I go to the, okay, I can't show you my screen. I want to say that what is the problem now? In almost all countries, we have only two poles. We have the centrist neoliberal pole, and we have a right-wing authoritarian, anti-liberal, I would say, pole. And the third pole, the pole of social democracy in this old, good-fashioned way, is missing. Yeah? And the problem.
I've just made you co-host, so you can share your screen.
Let's try if I can do it. A moment. Yes. Now it should work. You see, I think now you see it. Yeah, we have, and what I'm calling here the Alliance for a Solidarity Society is totally missing. The problem is that to gain majorities, close or 30-40% of the population, you need to combine different classes or milieus. Yeah? And we see here that the Social Liberal Alliance is combining the more libertarian-oriented part of the middle classes and the market-oriented middle classes. This is, let's say, the Obama current. Then we see others, this is Trump, of course, market-oriented middle classes and endangered wage earners and sub-proletarian groups. And what is missing is the third possibility, to create a majority that is a coalition between the libertarian-oriented middle classes and the endangered wage earners. I just wanted to make this visible to you, and this is a lesson the Germans and the European left has to learn. Then the next problem for us, of course, is that for Europe as a whole, that we should look back that the alliance with the United States after the end of the Cold War did not work for the Europeans and will not work in the future. We are now surrounded by wars. We are facing the very unstable situation in Eastern Europe toward Russia and so on, the Caucasus, then of course the whole mess in the Middle East, in Northern Africa and so on. We see the weaknesses inside the European Union. And so the development of the US politics showed that Europe is very weak and marked by deficiencies, and we have strengthened, following the example of neoliberalism, the negative integration, enlarging the European Union and strengthening the negative integration, the competition, and weakening the social and democratic integration. Yeah? And now we see we are spending only 1% for such a project like the European Union together. Yeah? The winners of this negative integration, Germany and the so-called core states, are not ready to support this integration. So all these problems we are facing, and I think I'm very pessimistic about the ability of Europe to change its politics. So the last point is, of course, China. John Ross already spoke about it. I'm very afraid that with Biden, the German and European politics will follow the Cold War orientation toward China. But we must know for European Union, which is in the western part of the Eurasian continent, China is the most important partner at all. Yeah? And if we want to have development on our larger continent, yeah, and stabilizing it, we should go in a totally different direction. But I think the ruling elites are still so much bound by the ideology of anti-communism, of this type of liberal ideology, that we are not able and ready to follow our own interests. This is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for making it possible to you.
That's great, Michael. Exemplary in terms of timing. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Claude Cerfati. He is associate researcher at the Institut de Recherche Économique et Sociale in France, and also somebody who I know writes a great deal about the political economy of both France, Europe, and more widely. So, and obviously I've also asked him to comment on France and EU-related matters. So, Claude, it's all yours.
Thank you, Radhika, and hello to everybody. So let me begin as a way of introduction on my theoretical background on transatlantic relations. I think that they are based on a hierarchical block of states based on formal economic, political, regulatory, and military agreements. Block of state means that I depart away from thesis on empire, with the US ruling Europe as a sovereign rules vassals, or also I depart away from the theory of a transatlantic capitalist class ruling the economic transatlantic area. That nation matters, that capitalist social relations are territorially bounded and politically built was evidenced by Trump and by what happened since the 28 crisis. So I would say that the transatlantic area remains a contested area, not a military contested area, of course, but it remains a contested space between competing capital with tensions which has been exacerbated by the new international economic and geopolitical setting featuring at the end of the 20s, what I called the 28 moment, the conflation of dramatic economic and geopolitical and social with Arab Spring events. So now let me move to how I see the Biden administration could reshuffle to some extent transatlantic relation. There is no doubt that most of member state government and EU big business voted Biden. It's sufficient to read the Financial Times 22 October issue titled Bidenomics Can Preserve Support for Capitalism. So, of course, Europe favors Biden election, even though some experts have hinted that Macron would have not been disappointed with a Trump success as more valuable for his European agenda, give Europe another wake-up shake and convince leaders to push ahead with Paris plan for a sovereign and strategically autonomous Europe. Sure, transatlantic relations will probably be played out on a quieter mode, and a way to try to divert away from tense relation between the US and the EU could be to build what has been called, and I wrote, a kind of united front against China. Thus, what is called return to multilateralism would be closer of preventing the foundation of the transatlantic bloc to further unravel. It's not unique to Democrats. Just in the last months of Trump administration, Pompeo proposed to the European High Representative for Foreign Policy, Borrell, to build a kind of bloc against China. And Biden could seize the end given by Macron when in April 28, in his state visit to Washington, he tried to convince Trump to I quote, "Let's work together, we both have a China problem," said Macron. So I think that this kind of proposal could get a good positive response from the Biden administration. Setting up a transatlantic front against China will not be so easy still. One, EU trade with China has considerably grown. In many countries, trade with China now overtakes trade with the US. Exports to the Chinese market fuel corporate Germany, and trade with and investment from China are now quite important in some EU countries, including the Czech Republic, Poland, Greece, Cyprus, and so on. So even European transatlantic influential think tanks, I think of the Council on European Reform, conclude that, I quote, "The EU needs to define its interest autonomously and devise policy to achieve its own objective, even if that means pushing back against ill-advised US policy or putting economic benefits at risk in order to stand up to China." It's the first snag against a united transatlantic front against China. Another issue is that the contentious disagreement remain important in the economic field between the US and the EU. I would just mention 2 points. One, the digital taxation issues, and as recently said a high civil servant at OECD, the man in charge of taxation at OECD, the French Saint-Amand, he said that, I quote, he does not think Joe Biden presidency would take a very different stance on digital tax, and I quote, Europeans underestimate how bipartisan the US position is. You cannot attack US tech companies. So it's the first contentious issue between the US and the EU. And the second contentious point is on the US tariffs on EU, mainly German cars. So I know that a lot of people and think tank, American think tank, British think tank, saying that Biden will be softer on trade issue, but I disagree with this view. Of course, the trade advisor to Biden, Mr. Blinken, said we need to bring to an end an artificial trade war that the Trump administration started. But I think that behind the words we have the reality, and the reality is that as far as I understand the situation in the US, the US society and politics is profoundly divided. And I am not sure that Biden will be able to build a coalition and will want to build a coalition in favor of a real multilateralism, coming back to the good times of the post-decade era. So I think that just to conclude on this point, that the conflation of economic and geopolitical events since the end of the 2000s exacerbated the competition between capital, including, of course, national capital, including between American capital and European capital. And of course, we could find a way of agreement on some points, but the fact that the EU tries to become a geopolitical power, as they said, was not due to Trump administration, but was due to what I call the shortening of the distance between geopolitical and economic issue on the world scale, and the shortening of this distance was created by the new situation looming after the 2008 crisis, economic and geopolitical crisis. So it's a long way before we see a kind of united front between the US and the EU. Okay.
Thank you very much, Claude. Fantastic, great analysis. I would now like to turn to Tomo Marukawa. He is professor at the University of Tokyo, and I know that in addition to his expertise on China and Japan, he's also an expert on Japan-US relations, so I think he'll have a lot to say to us. So, Tomo, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Radhika. Well, let me introduce about the reactions to the current situation in the United States presidential election here in Japan. I've checked for the editorials of 4 major newspapers here in Japan, which range from right-wing Sankei to liberal Asahi, and all of them denounce Trump's attempt to undermine the election and or split the United States. A slight difference is that the Sankei says Trump made a great contribution in confronting China, and but even that right-wing Sankei says that Trump has been too crude in his behavior and speech, so that it is difficult for him to be reelected. And Asahi, which is the liberal one, argues that America needs a leader who is inclusive and liberal to the diversification of the U.S. society. And Yomiuri, which is a conservative paper, is worried that if the struggle over the counting of votes linger on, then there will be a vacuum in world politics and economy. Well, unfortunately, there are some extreme right commentators in Japan who turn out to be quite influential in social media that side with Trump and insist that Biden is leading the election because of fraud. Uh, I'm not sure why they are so sympathetic to Trump. I think that is because Trump had been tough on China, and they say that if Biden wins, then the world is going to be dominated by China. So, and in fact, the extreme right was a great supporter of Japan's former Prime Minister Abe and also his successor Suga. And the position of Suga on this issue remains unclear at the moment, but it seems that he also shares the view of the extreme right because he said that if Trump wins the election, he's going to Washington and celebrate Trump. But if Biden wins, he's not going. But I don't think that is the mainstream view in the Japanese government, because Biden's position on, for example, climate change or on international trade is much closer to the Japanese government's official position. And for the Japanese business, less aggressive policy on China will be beneficial. And I think Japanese government want the U.S. to be committed to the stabilization of East Asian international relations, because Japan faces a tough challenge from the North Korea nuclear development and also rising China and tensions in East and South China Seas. So in general, I think Biden will be a better president for Japan's foreign policy, domestic policy in general. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tomo. Next, I have Kate Hudson, whose presentation we have recorded. So, Brendan, would you please put Kate's presentation quickly on?
Yes, just going to set that up now.
I should say, while Brendan is doing that Kate Hudson is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK and a prominent writer on nuclear and peace issues. Go ahead, Brendan. You have to start again, I think, with the volume.
Is the volume not on?
No.
Okay.
That's better, I think.
For this contribution, the outcome of the election is still uncertain. Joe Biden seems to be edging closer to victory, but the clear and early win predicted by the pollsters just hasn't happened. Votes, as we know, are still being counted in a number of key states where the result is too close to call. There has rightly been outrageous attempts by President Trump to claim victory, to stop the counting of votes, and to undermine the democratic process. We are in close touch with peace activists in the US. As one of our partners in the movement has said, constitutional democracy and so much more hang in the balance. Every vote must be counted, and committed advocacy and organising for democracy, peace, justice, and the climate must continue. We couldn't agree more, and it's been shameful to see that the Foreign Secretary here in the UK, Dominic Raab, has refused to say that Trump was wrong to claim victory in the election. And we are demanding here in the movement our government stands up for democracy and rejects any attempts to curtail the democratic process. In fact, we've been working actively with others here, writing to our MPs, lobbying on this issue. because we cannot just be bystanders in this momentous struggle. It's not enough just to shout at the TV. We have to do what we can here to help. So we send our best wishes to grassroots groups that are working to defend US democracy. So what difference will the outcome make for us in terms of peace campaigning? Sometimes people suggest that it doesn't make any difference who is in the White House, but we do not share this view. Trump and Biden are both committed to US hegemony, but there are differences of approach that can make an enormous difference to the future of the planet. The underlying factor is, of course, the US's long-term economic decline, simultaneous with the economic rise of China. This is the fundamental issue of our age, and the most important priority is to avoid war as this global balance changes. War between nuclear-armed states is potentially a nuclear war, and this will destroy us all. Clearly, a Biden presidency would continue with the main thrust of US policy, particularly with regard to China. After all, the pivot to Asia originated as a policy under President Obama's leadership. But in terms of a range of issues, there would be opportunities to turn away from the most damaging paths chosen by Trump. It looks likely that Biden would go back to the Paris Climate Accords. Few things can be more important than seriously addressing the climate emergency. And it's also possible that he will take the US back into the Iran nuclear deal. It's not lost on many observers that Trump was intensely critical of it as an Obama deal. Biden would also be likely to extend the New START treaty, to cut some of the new weapons programs that Trump has initiated. It has also been suggested that he would limit nuclear use to retaliation, something that Trump had explicitly moved away from. In fact, for the peace and anti-nuclear movement, the Trump presidency has introduced some extremely alarming policies. Not only his strategic shift towards confrontation with Russia and China, and his massive increase in spending on nuclear weapons, but it also his nuclear posture review. This included an increased range of scenarios in which nuclear weapons could be used, and a commitment to the production of a new generation of so-called usable nuclear weapons. Those weapons have now been produced and are actually deployed on US nuclear submarines. At the beginning of this year, US atomic scientists moved the hands of the infamous doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, which represents man-made global catastrophe. This is the closest the hands have ever been, even at the height of the Cold War. The reason is the increasing likelihood of nuclear war and climate catastrophe. Judging by policies and actions of both presidential candidates, a Biden victory makes both nuclear war and climate catastrophe less of a certainty. And if he does enter the White House, then the work will step up to ensure that he fulfills these policy pledges. Nothing can be left to chance. The stakes are just too high. We will be working with the peace movement in the US and internationally to make the progress that we need together to survive. But above all, we do not forget that this election is about the everyday lives of US citizens. They can defend and extend their rights, live at peace and free from fear, and exercise the opportunities promised by the American tradition in a diverse and inclusive society. Our hearts are with them at this very difficult time.
Great, Brendan, and yeah, very clear and concise analysis by Kate, who reminds us that there are important differences between the Trump and the Biden camp. We hope that she will be proved right, particularly on the nuclear matter. Next, we go to Gavin Ray. Gavin Ray is a British sociologist, but he has lived in Poland for many years, and he's based there now. And I will ask him to pronounce the name of the organization he belongs to. Otherwise, I will make a mess of it, but he's based in Warsaw. Gavin, it's yours, please.
Okay, thank you. It's Fundację Naprzód, which means the Forward Foundation. It's the Polish organization of Transform. So I'm going to talk briefly, of course, about what's occurring in Central and Eastern Europe, I'll call it here, and I will be primarily the region which of the countries which previously belonged to the Eastern Bloc and now within the European Union, and I'll focus particularly on Poland and Hungary. The victory for Biden, or the probable victory for Biden, causes a number of problems for the governments in the region. The region has been within the European Union. Central East European countries have tended to be the most supportive of Trump, particularly in countries such as Hungary and Poland. This was shown during the election campaign, when you had open support from some leaders for Trump. For example, Orban, the president of Hungary, openly said that it would be better for Central Eastern Europe if Trump were elected. He said, we are rooting for a victory of Donald Trump. And he said this was because the Democratic administration's foreign policy is based upon what he called moral imperialism. And he says, quote, we have tasted it and we didn't like it. Polish leaders have not openly come out and supported to Trump. So the president or the prime minister have not openly come out and supported Trump, but the politicians connected to the ruling party have been vocal in their support for Trump. The public media over the last couple of days have been pushing the Trump narrative during the elections, while the opposite, of course, the private media, which is a lot of it is US owned and German owned, has come behind Biden. The Slovenian president even congratulated Trump on the night of the election, saying congratulated him on his victory. So this shows it. You also have within the populations of the region some of the strongest support for Trump. This is particularly in Poland. Poland was the European country where in recent opinion polls, which has a positive sentiment towards Trump. And this increased throughout the term in office. So at the beginning of the term in office, the positive sentiment towards Trump within Polish society was 23%. By 2018, this had grown to 51%. At the beginning of, by 2020, the beginning of 2020, it had grown to 51%. So there was increase in support for Trump throughout his term in office. Now, why is this? In one term, they said one of the is to understand it within the division within Europe, and the conservative, so-called liberal leaders in countries such as Hungary and Poland, who have been in conflict with Brussels and sections of the EU. This has particularly been around the question of the rule of law, the independence of the courts, and also on issues such as LGBT rights and so forth. So this has been, well, to quote Radica, this is a kind of cultural nationalism, which has been, within the region of countries such as Poland and Hungary, trying to exert a semi-form of autonomy within Europe through so-called cultural issues, etc. Strategically as well, Trump has continued the US policy of seeing Poland as its main strategic ally in the region. Trump decided to redeploy thousands of US troops from Germany to Poland. Poland government itself announced plans to house up to 20,000 troops on Polish soil, extra troops on Polish soil. When the President Duda went to Poland, to US a year or so ago, they even talked about building what they called a Camp Trump, which would be where you have hosted these US troops. and also that Poland would pay for them, more or less. So it was to have the privilege of US troops on Polish soil. So then in the opposite side to this, or not the opposite is the Biden line, which at least in its ostensibly is more pro-Europe, or seeks the transatlantic alliance stronger, and has expressed some hostility towards the governments in Central Eastern Europe. So during the election campaign, Biden said, and again I quote here, "You see what is happening from Belarus through Poland and Hungary and the rise of totalitarian regimes in the world. Our current president supports all thugs in the world. He sends love letters to Korean dictator and is incapable of chastising Putin." So in this quote, Biden calls Poland a totalitarian country, which is ridiculous in its exaggeration. There are many problems with the Polish government, as we're all aware. But the idea that Poland is a totalitarian country is just ludicrous. He has also said that he would review hosting German troops, redeploying German troops to Poland. So this is on the one hand, therefore, the sort of break from Trump. On the other hand, there will be a continuity. So the Biden-Harris campaign, for example, said that the Democrats were pledged to supporting Poland in NATO and crucially opposing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany. So although there will be some readjusting of positions if Biden comes in, the essential strategic position of Poland and the region as being important parts of the NATO campaign and the NATO alliance will remain. On China, what is interesting is that part of Central Eastern European countries, particularly Hungary, Serbia, Poland to an extent, and others, have opened up agreements or negotiations with China on investment. There's a setup of the organization called the 16+1. I think it's a 17+1 now, actually, where the Prime Minister of China meets with prime ministers from Central Eastern Europe to discuss investments and agree investments each year. This has been quite opposed by the European Union itself, because what they wish is any agreements which come between China and Central Eastern Europe go through the EU first, and that they don't have any kind of independent or autonomous relationship or on this front with China. So if we're looking at this kind of relationship between the region and China, it's not necessarily that Biden will make this easier or not. He will probably be more allied with the European German position on this. If we look also then sort of finally of what may happen in the region, we have, looking eastwards, of course, the situation recently in Belarus. And on this, again, the statements coming, that Poland is in somehow, just one more minute, I'll finish. Is it Poland is like a totalitarian country and so on and so forth. A few weeks ago, Poland was being presented as the example of what Belarus should do. And the opposition leadership in Belarus and the presidential candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she was housed, they've been given headquarters in Poland, in Warsaw, as almost like an alternative government in waiting. So this process, I imagine, will continue. We know also with the Ukraine during the previous administration that the Democratic administration was very much pushing the color revolutions and so forth in Eastern Europe. Biden and his son in Ukraine and all of this scandal, etc., etc. What will be interesting to see is, will this be continued? Will they start to take on, for example, more of an active role of supporting the opposition in these kind of countries, etc. Okay, I'll finish there because of time.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Gavin. Gavin, that was really thought-provoking. And We will come back to many of the themes that you are talking about in the discussion. I'd now like to invite Dimitri Lascaris, and I have a great pleasure in introducing him. He is a lawyer, a journalist, and an activist, as he describes himself. But I should also add that only last month, Dimitri ran for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada and put in such a strong showing that he has made a left eco-socialist current in the Green Party impossible to control. And what's more, he's actually raised the profile of left and eco-socialist issues more broadly in the country, so that, you know, in a certain sense, the reverberations have gone far beyond the Green Party of Canada. And this is something, of course, that Canada much needs at the moment, where all parties are in a kind of stultified mode at the moment. But anyway, let me go straight to Dimitri. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. First of all, let me acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people here in what is now Montreal, and they are the two true custodians of the land on which I'm privileged to live and work. I should also add that Radhika was the chair of my campaign's platform committee, and in that capacity did an absolutely brilliant job. And if you're interested in seeing the platform which she did so much to formulate and which inspired so many people to support our campaign, you can see it on our campaign website, teamdimitri.ca. Now, getting to the question at hand, in my view, envisioning how a Biden presidency will alter the world order is not particularly challenging, because in substance, there is not much that separates Biden and Trump. I believe, despite voices to the contrary here in Canada, that the differences between them are largely differences of style and tone. So why do I say that? Let's look first of all at foreign policy and defense. Both Trump and Biden fully subscribe to the notion of American exceptionalism and are fully committed to the project of American global hegemony. Both are warmongers. In fact, in that regard, Biden might actually be worse than Trump. For example, in one of the debates, Biden embraced the unsubstantiated claim of US intelligence that Iran was trying to interfere in the 2020 US election by obtaining voter registration information, and Biden vowed to make them, quote unquote, pay a price. One ought to ask, hasn't Trump caused Iran to pay enough of a price? What more would Biden do that Trump already hasn't done to cause immense suffering to the people of Iran and to destabilize the region? Let's remember as well that it was under Obama that Libya was destroyed by the US-led NATO coalition, and Syria was bombed relentlessly by the US military, and there's no indication that Biden opposed these military aggressions in his capacity as vice president. Biden also voted for the resolution that paved the way for the Iraq War, and for a non-binding resolution to authorize the bombing of Yugoslavia, which caused massive suffering to innocents. Under Trump, America's already stratospheric levels of military spending rose year after year, but Biden stated during the campaign that he did not foresee significant cuts to military spending under a Biden administration. Now, on nuclear weapons, Brendan Devlin, who spoke a moment ago quite eloquently, was entirely correct to denounce Trump's criminally insane nuclear weapons policies. But let's recall that the Obama administration initiated $1 trillion nuclear, quote unquote, modernization program that expanded to involve not just improving a few old warheads, but the development and upgrading of a vast array of new weapons, including bombers, ballistic missiles, and submarines. And in my opinion, this program is a flagrant violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And finally, on Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, Biden said during the campaign that he would not move the American embassy back to Tel Aviv. And furthermore, that he did not plan to alter America's formal recognition of Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, which is a blatant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. On the environment, both Trump and Biden repeatedly vowed during the campaign not to ban fracking, which has resulted in the US becoming the world's largest producer of oil at a time when fossil fuel consumption has exposed humanity to an existential climate crisis. On the question of whether Biden supports the Green New Deal, Biden was utterly incoherent during the campaign. His website calls the Green New Deal a, quote, crucial framework for meeting the climate challenges we face. But in one of the debates, Trump accused Biden of supporting the, quote unquote, radical Green New Deal, which Trump falsely alleged would cost $100 trillion. And Biden responded by saying, the Green New Deal is not my plan. Then just a few minutes later, he said the Green New Deal will pay for itself as we move forward. And then minutes later said, no, I don't support the Green New Deal. So it is far from clear whether Biden does support it, but with a Republican-controlled Senate, the whole question is academic anyways, because it is extremely unlikely that the Republican-controlled Senate would embrace legislation that implemented the Green New Deal. Now, what about the Paris Climate Accord? Trump, of course, took the United States out of it, but Biden may very well try to return the United States into the Paris Climate Accord. That would have to get through the Senate, because the Senate has the authority under the US Constitution to approve treaties. But what happens anyways if he does get the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord? The agreement is essentially toothless. There are no provisions for enforcing emission reduction targets under the Paris Climate Accord. And that, by the way, is largely the fault of the Obama administration. It was Obama who opposed binding emission reduction targets in the Paris climate negotiations. Let's talk briefly about domestic issues like taxes and healthcare. Both Biden and Trump oppose Medicare for all, despite the fact that a recent poll from Fox News, no less, found that 72% of Americans support government-controlled health insurance. On taxes, Biden vowed not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. To what extent he'll keep his promise to raise taxes on those who make more than that sum remains to be seen. But let's recall that under Obama, the US government signed off on an $858 billion tax cut deal in 2010, and it made the Bush tax cuts permanent. On immigration and trade policy, the Obama administration deported far more people in its first term than Trump did during his 4 years in office. So it's hard to take seriously Biden's claim that he will pursue a much more humane immigration policy than Trump. On trade policy, for decades, Democratic and Republican leaders in the House and of Representatives in Congress have strongly favored the prevailing neoliberal trade regime, which is lowering barriers to trade with no meaningful protections for human rights, labor rights, or the environment, incorporating ISDS provisions into trade agreements, which allow corporations to sue governments for potentially vast sums when they take action in the public interest that lowers the profitability of foreign corporations. And of course, this trade regime has facilitated the transfer of production to low-cost jurisdictions, which has cost countless good-paying jobs to developed economies. Now, Trump pretended to break with this tradition of bipartisan support for the prevailing neoliberal trade regime, but that was not, in my view, motivated by disagreement of a philosophical nature with that regime. Rather, it was primarily an attempt to constrain China's growth and to attract working class American voters to his candidacy under the pretense of pursuing a more worker-oriented international trade policy. So now I'll focus briefly on how a Biden presidency is likely to affect Canadians. First is the question of the Keystone XL pipeline, which is very important to Canada's tar sand industry, although less so since the Trudeau government spent billions of dollars to buy the Trans Mountain tar sands pipeline and to expand it. Under Obama, under intense pressure from the environmental movement, the Keystone XL permit was canceled, but then it was revived, the project under Trump, much to the joy of the Trudeau government, which claims to be serious about climate change. And it's entirely possible that Biden will either cancel that permit or will at least frustrate the development of the Keystone XL pipeline through additional regulatory hurdles. But at the end of the day, it is not going to have a dramatic impact because of Trans Mountain and because of other aspects of Biden's environmental policies on Canada, despite claims to the contrary. The nuclear weapons policy of the Biden administration, unlikely to affect the Trudeau government. There will continue to be pressure on the Trudeau government not to accede to the nuclear weapons ban treaty, which it did not do, and in fact went even further and criticized the treaty and those who were negotiating it under pressure from the US government. I think that pressure will continue. On trade policy, Biden has said he wants to promote Buy American policies and procurement, but this is not new to Canada. the Canadian government of Stephen Harper failed to gain any meaningful exemptions from Buy American provisions in the 2009 Obama-era Recovery Act. And subsequently, the US refused to budge on Buy American rules during the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And finally, Canada again came up empty-handed in the new NAFTA negotiations on Buy American policies, despite its willingness to guarantee US suppliers access to almost all Canadian procurement at every level of government. Finally, on the pandemic, the Canada-US border has been closed for months to all but traffic deemed essential by the Canadian-American governments. As we all know, the pandemic is out of control in the United States. And I ask, how will Biden get control of the pandemic without the kind of lockdowns we're seeing in Europe? I'm skeptical, frankly, based on Biden's public comments that his administration will pursue a complete or even partial national lockdown. His campaign rhetoric seemed to suggest that the US could get control of the crisis without lockdowns and through some combination of increased use of masks, more spending to help businesses remain open safely, and increased testing. So I'm having trouble believing that there is going to be a serious change in the US government's approach to the pandemic. And if that remains the case, that the pandemic is not brought under control, it's going to continue to have a profound impact in cross-border traffic between the United States and Canada. And the United States is by far the largest trading partner of Canada. In conclusion, both globally in Canada, the victory of Biden will not likely result in dramatic substantive changes, but we will see a return to a much more restrained and diplomatic rhetoric, including in the relationship between Canada and the United States. And a final word, you know, as some of you have commented, the Democrats, despite extraordinarily favorable electoral circumstances, failed to gain control or seem to have failed to gain control of the Republican, of the Senate. And in my view, I would not at all be surprised if Joe Biden is somewhat relieved about that, because that will enable him to use Republican control of the Senate as an excuse to constantly thwart the demands of the very small progressive wing of the Democratic Party. No one would like to be more wrong than myself about all of this. I hope that Biden turns out to be a passionate and principled progressive, and that everything I've said about him turns out to be untrue. But I must say that I remain quite skeptical about there being a dramatic and positive change in world affairs as a result of a Biden presidency.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. As usual, a very driving and compelling analysis. Thank you very much. We have next someone I also am very pleased to introduce. Carlos Ron is the Vice Minister for North America in Venezuela's Ministry of Foreign Relations. You could say that Carlos is really on the coalface of the resistance to American empire. So without further ado, Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and thank you everyone for this invitation. Well, for us, I guess I think we need to start by saying that for some years now, including the Obama administration, where Biden had a key role, you know, the U.S. policy has been regime change in Venezuela, and nothing at this point tells us that that is in any way going to immediately change or transform. I should say that, you know, just to give you a general context, we don't have diplomatic relations with the United States since January of 2019. Their embassy effectively shut down in March because we kept a period of time trying to see if we would set up a sort of a special interest type of arrangement, but that didn't work out. And eventually they even took over our embassy in May of 2019 and handed it over to the pro-US opposition. So communications with the US government have been seriously diminished, although they're not completely cut off. Every so often we have exchanges for specific issues. Now, the United States doesn't recognize President Maduro, and their strategy against Venezuela was to embark in an international campaign for the recognition of an interim government, which has no legal grounding and no effective popular support in Venezuela. But it does enjoy the U.S. protection, and it has actually seized or has access to assets seized from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan state, including most notably the case of Citgo, which is an oil company in the United States that was owned by Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA. So the current U.S. policy towards Venezuela, you could basically sum it up as what they call the maximum pressure campaign, which combines the use of robust sanctions, what they call, these coercive measures, a diplomatic effort to isolate Venezuela and to support this dual power scenario, and the use of different types of destabilization tactics aimed at spurring somehow the regime change from within. And by that I mean, we have seen throughout this year an attempt by mercenaries to invade the coast of Venezuela. We have seen attempts by to make the military turn against the government and so forth, and incite protests and all this. I should say that Venezuela was also a campaign issue in the United States, and this is probably very important and probably different from other countries in the region, in the sense that Venezuela was an everyday issue in the campaign. If you look at the last, I fair to say about the last 40 to 50 speeches that Trump gave during his campaign, he mentioned Venezuela at least once, and the reason was that he was so focused on winning Florida, where there's an important Venezuelan American population. We currently estimate that there's about 169,000 Venezuelan Americans, that is, Venezuelan citizens with the possibility to vote, and of which 50,000 alone live in Florida. And as you can see by the results or lack thereof, there's 50,000 votes can really make an important difference. So throughout the campaign, both parties, but particularly Trump, catered to this Venezuelan American group, which is probably the second, I would venture to say, the second major Latino group to reproduce that Cuban American model, where they're more conservative. It's an opposition that is composed mostly of middle class, well-educated immigrants that have resources and that have political aspirations. So it's not comparable to your working class laborers that come from, for example, from Mexico or other Central American countries. It's a different type of immigration, and both campaigns try to offer something. Trump offered a very hardline position against our government, and Biden focused more on offering temporary protection status against under this premise that people are fleeing to the United States or being somehow persecuted and so forth. Venezuela also gave Trump talking points in the sense of in an ideological way. Every time these speeches would basically his narrative or two sentences would be, Venezuela, look at Venezuela. Venezuela's where socialism was put into place, and now it's a country that is a complete disaster. The once rich country is now a disaster because of socialist policies, and Biden is a socialist, and basically he's going to turn the United States into a giant Venezuela. And that was more or less the issue and how it came to play. But that meant that Venezuela was constantly in the campaign and in all the discussions. To a lesser extent, but I wouldn't dismiss it, and I think it's important. It might be important in the coming years. There was this campaign to try to portray Venezuela in these terms of allowing terrorism to come into the region. Alleged relations with Hezbollah or with some Colombian guerrilla trying to say that Venezuela was a transnational terrorist sponsor, something to that effect. There's no evidence. It's never presented. It's just a narrative that it's been constructed. But we will see how that develops in the coming years. It was interesting to see how much it picked up during the last couple of months. What we can foresee about a Biden Venezuelan policy, well, his Latin American team is basically the same team that was with him before, and it was basically Obama's Latin American team. I mean, they were responsible for the reestablishing of diplomatic relations with Cuba. but they were also responsible for declaring Venezuela the unusual, extraordinary threat. They opened the way to the sanctions that later were implemented by Trump. Venezuela was always expendable to them during their negotiations because we weren't the key issue. I mean, their key issue was always Cuba or something else, and in the every time they had to concede something to Republicans, for example, with the Iran deal and with the Cuba relations, Venezuela was sacrificed. And at one point there were sanctions, another point other measures taken, but it was always the trade-in. So we don't see if we'll see how if that continues to be the same thing. The question would be is how Biden is going to approach Venezuela, whether from a domestic perspective, I mean meaning catering to that Florida support group, or as a foreign policy issue in itself. If it's just a foreign policy issue, then we'll probably go down to the list of priorities. I mean, there were other things that will be more important. Obviously, you've discussed this here. China, Russia, even Iran and Cuba will be first on the agenda. However, we are transversal to all those cases, so somehow we will always end up as being an issue. His campaign has promised to depart from the Trump policy, from turning into a smart sanctions policy, what they say, that is not employ sanctions that in the end they believe actually work against their objectives. But I think most likely it will be a return to the Obama years type of policy, in the sense that there will be continuous pressures on the Venezuelan government. There will be continuous pressures for having new presidential elections. And then the narrative will turn once again to human rights, to the need of economic and institutional reform, to the need of humanitarian relief. All these things are, sort of have been constructed in narratives, and it will be kind of complicated to get into details now, but it has been, they're secondary to their main objective, which is presidential elections, where basically they can succeed at putting their candidate up and removing President Maduro from office. Biden's going to find a very different map in Latin America, which is something that I think is hardening. He's going to have some uncomfortable allies like Bolsonaro and Duque and even Piñera, with the new advances by popular movements that it is my understanding that they really threw off Washington in the last couple of weeks, that being the tremendous victory in Bolivia, the results in Chile, possible coming victory in Ecuador as well. So to this, basically Biden will probably resort, and this is a speculation, but they will probably resort to trying to increase aid in Latin America and trying to make that his policy tool. Lastly, what's our perspective and what are we going to do? We have said, well, we haven't gotten into this discussion about the whole elections. We try to avoid making comments on what's going on for the U.S. people to figure it out. We have reiterated that we are open to dialogue as long as it's based in mutual respect. That's always been the way that we've asked for this, and we're committed to maintaining, the peace of the country, to maintaining our territorial integrity, our national sovereignty, complying to our constitutional norms. So it's probably not going to be an easy relationship, whichever way it comes, but we are open to see what their approach is going to be. And we are taking our measures to prevent or to help our people improve living conditions. We just approved an anti-blockade law that is trying to flexibilize certain procedures in a way that this attack against anyone that does business with Venezuela is somehow, we bypass it somehow, and we are able to safely deliver things to the Venezuelan people. I would say that the concern here is this.
If you could wrap up quickly,
yes,
Carlos.
Yes, just close enough. I would just say this, that the concern is still that there is this intention of removing us from government, and I think that there was a lot of things that have advanced during the Trump administration, particularly with the level of sanctions. I mean, some of them have been placed into law in Congress, and they'll be very hard to remove. So we'll see how that works. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry about that. I'm just bearing in mind that people probably have loads of questions. I've actually been writing down some for you myself, but let's finish the presentations first. So next, I have again the great pleasure of introducing Yash Tandon. Many of you may know his work. He has been engaged in thinking about African policy, political economy, politics, etc., for the last many decades. He's a Ugandan policymaker, political activist, professor, author, and an important African intellectual. So, Yash, the floor is yours. Yash? Oh, we seem to have lost him. Oh, no, he's here. Yash, are you...
He's muted, I think.
Yeah, he's supposed to be here.
Now,
Yash, is that you? Please go ahead.
okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great.
We can't see you. You may want to turn on your video.
Oh, I see. Video was not on.
Video is on.
I wonder where I have to go.
Your video is on. I can see you.
Okay,
Video is
great. Great. Go
It
ahead.
was on briefly.
Now, can you see?
Yes, we can see you. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Radhika for organizing this. It's wonderful that there are people here with whom many of ideas I share. I want to recognize at least two good friends here, Roger Zwanenberg and also Michael Bree from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. We know each other for a long time. Well, I want to make 3 points. One is, first of all, I'm looking at it from an African perspective. It's very important that Africa gets not discussed very much globally. And that should be a matter for great concern to all of us. I understand that for America, it is Latinos who are the refugees there. But for Europe, it is Africa. And they come because of the wars that Europe and America have launched in Africa. In Somalia, in Libya, in many of our countries, these wars have created refugees. But there's no discussion in the media anywhere in Europe. I lived in Europe many years, but they never discuss. They say, refugees are coming, we don't want them, put them in Turkey. And the cause, they never analyze the cause, even the media, liberal media. And the cause is the wars that they have unleashed on Africa. So that's important, that I want to put this African perspective on board. Let me say the first point is that it makes no difference to us in Africa who wins elections in America. You can choose between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's no difference between the two candidates. For us, this democracy thing in America is a facade from African point of view. Because whether it is Churchill in the 1940s and 50s or Barack Obama in our era, these are imperial countries led by imperialists who have ruled Africa. I must say that when Obama came to power, I had tears in my eyes. First time an African American became president. So in Africa, we coined a phrase, OBAMA, stands for our brother, OBAMA, our brother from Africa to manage America. OBAMA, our brother from Africa to manage America. And now it's the opposite. Our brother in America to manage Africa, because that's what Obama has done. So for us, even Obama let us down. So for us, democracy in our countries is not of anything, because the fundamental reality on the ground, material ground, is that African economies are controlled by Euro-American corporations. I'll come to China later, but China is different. But we don't control our economy. In fact, we don't control our regimes. We're going to have elections in Uganda early next year, and I can be witness to the fact that although the infighting amongst our own people for power based on ethnic grounds or political grounds is dividing us, but the divisive factor is always outside. Even now, divide and rule. So we have that kind of situation, and therefore what happens in America makes no difference to us, our reality on the ground. It's very hard reality. The second point I want to make, and some of the speakers have already touched on that, is the rise of China and the collapse of Euro-American empire. Euro-Americans are now facing final decline. In a sense, even capitalism is facing its final crisis. If China is a capitalist state now, or neo-capitalist state now, it's a capitalism of a different kind. But I'm not an expert on that. But certainly the Euro-American brand of capitalism is meeting its end. And I think the point that John Ross made, the quotation from IMF, saying that the 60% of growth in China compared to 4% or so in America is quite, for me, it opened my eyes. And therefore, I want to come to the second point, the collapse of Euro-American empire. The problem with collapsing on empires is that before their demise, they create chaos. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. That's what happened to the British Empire. And the British were taken over by the Americans, who ruled us for over 50 years. But that's happening to American Empire, collapsing in front of our eyes. And that is something that we in Africa ought to be wary of, careful about, because we are not sufficiently careful about that. And they are creating chaos in Libya, in Turkey, in Somalia, in Southern Africa, they create Mozambique, and they are still going to hold on to their empire, challenged as it is by the Chinese, and create chaos. So that's the second point I want to make, that this collapse of Euro-American empire and the rise of China. Now, China, well, China is a capitalist country in a sense with Chinese characteristics, as they call it, or socialism with Chinese characteristics. But yeah, but it is different. From an African perspective, the Chinese have been more development friendly to us than Europe and America. For example, the corporations that come from America and Europe want their profits within a year or 2 years maximum. And none of them will put money into infrastructure building. The Chinese are doing this. They're building roads, railways, and the profits don't come for a long time. And though that infrastructure is helpful to us, and therefore they have a slightly different take on that. Also, again, as John Ross mentioned, they have a very good technology. TikTok, for example, he mentioned. And now the Chinese are ahead of America in technology by far. And the good thing about China-Africa relationship is that the Chinese are prepared to transfer technological know-how to us without conditions. The intellectual property rights, IPs, that the Euro-American corporations insist on our countries, China is not insisting. Euro-American pharmaceutical companies come to Africa. In Zimbabwe, I worked for 23 years, go to our forests, collect our knowledge from our traditional healers and herbalists, then put them into medicines and call it their intellectual property and sell it at exorbitant price. That's what's happening to Euro-American empire. But the Chinese are different, and I'll still keep my view open on China. It might change, but so far it has been positive for us in Africa, and it's open. It wants oil in Sudan. It does not talk human rights issues. America, Europe say, oh, there are human rights violations in Sudan, so you must not buy that oil. Chinese are open. They say we are coming for oil. Human rights is an internal issue. We don't want to interfere in internal issues of African countries. So this we think is reasonable. Okay, I'll come to my third point. I don't want to be long. My third point is the corona crisis. Coronavirus. You have written a lot on that too, as I see in the literature. And the coronavirus crisis offers us, well, a silver lining, an opportunity, which I am working on now. I'm in Uganda, and I'm working on, one of the things I'm working on is import substitution industrialization. So that because trade is no longer that free as before, it opens the possibility for us in Africa to create options. And we are now working on value-added production so that our raw materials are turned into manufactured products. That's what we are working on. And therefore, there is a silver lining in this sense. So and there's an added silver lining to that, because the trade flows are no longer that open as before. By the way, I have written a book called Trade is War. Trump came after me. He must have read my book, and he calls it war, because I wrote that book a long time ago in Geneva. And trade is war. It has always been war. Okay, I'll finish it quickly. And now that the borders are closed between Europe and Africa to some extent, there's a possibility of East Africa unite and Africa also unite. So let me just close on that note of optimism, that what is pessimism for Europe and America opens the road for us to a positive future. Thank you very much, Radhika.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Yash. And okay, so we should now move on to our penultimate speaker, Oscar Ugarteche, who is professor at the Institute of Economic Investigations at UNAM, Mexico's premier university, and works on the political economy, both of international political economy as well as Latin American political economy. So, Oscar, the floor is yours. Oscar? Oscar, you're muted. Please unmute yourself. Okay.
There we are. Thank you very much. What we're working on, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. What we're working on at our observatory are the impacts of the global economy on Latin America. And we can see there is a difference between the Caribbean Basin countries and the South American countries. China has a much bigger impact in South America than it does in the Caribbean Basin. From Mexico down to Panama, the importance of the United States as a trading partner is much larger than for its South American partners. Now, what this implies is that China is doing things in the South that it is not doing in Mexico and cannot do in Mexico or in Central America. China has put, in one way or another, $140 billion US in South America between loans and investments. And this makes China one of the largest, if not the largest, investment partner. So when we speak, and Carlos was mentioning USAID to compensate its policies in Latin America, there is no way the US can compensate Chinese presence. No way. For us, like for Yash, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, we have had the most recent coup, the new, what we call now the soft coup d'etats, which is Paraguay and Brazil. They were done under Obama. Another soft coup was against Evo Morales. And the reasons are the same old reasons. It's control of resources, it's water in Paraguay, it's lithium in Bolivia. And in the case of Brazil, it's the political importance of Brazil because of its size. So that was the reason. They had to get rid of the PT in order to recover the management, the hold on Brazil. Now, we don't expect much of anything from the new president. For Mexico, for the Mexican government, it's going to be rough because the current Mexican government has been very pro-Trump. It went in July to the US for it was the start of the trade agreement. And the Mexican president went during the presidential election period to give a speech. I think that was a mistake, but he went. And the other thing that happened is that the US asked for Mexican troops to be placed in the Guatemalan border in order to prevent migration coming in from Guatemala into Mexico. And Mexico did it. So the current government is more aligned with a Republican government than it has been with the previous government. So Biden is bad news in that sense. But we don't expect any major change. The other thing that is different with Mexico than with the rest of Latin America is that the US treats Mexico as a failed state. So it does stop and has now extradited several people in the drug cartels, several ministers. The Secretary of Defense is now, the former Secretary of Defense is now in a US jail because he's linked to the drug trade. That's absolutely treating Mexico like a failed state. That's not the case with the rest of Latin America. I mean, that's very much the case of Mexico. What I think is serious is the Trump administration policy against Cuba and Venezuela. I think if it's true that there are shades of gray, the shade in Cuba is very much darker. I mean, they're really strangling Cuba. They have had just announced the other day a proscription for the Cuban military to deal in foreign exchange. And as we know, the foreign exchange houses in Cuba are managed by the army. So that's going to strangle them further. So I hope the Biden administration is more relaxed on that front. We don't expect much changes with Venezuela. And we just saw yesterday an attempt against the life of the new president of Bolivia. So, digamos, they're going to continue attempting. Now, the scenario has changed. Latin America is shifting back to the left. What's happened in Bolivia and Chile is a shift to the left. What happened in Argentina as well. The election with Alberto Fernandez was also a shift to the left. We're expecting the same shift to the left in Ecuador. Central America has a different dynamics, I think. It's much more subordinate to the US than South America. It's much closer. And their economies depend a lot more on the US than South America. So the change doesn't mean much on the one hand. On the other hand, there are shades of gray that will change, particularly with Cuba. We don't know it with Venezuela, because with Venezuela has been an increscendo for the past 10 years. What we're worried about is that the importance of the US in the South American economies is reducing very fast. That's the decline in the US economy. What we see is that the US has announced, the new chairman of the Inter-American Development Bank has announced a $50 billion package. Of course, I don't think anybody is going to borrow money from the Inter-American Development Bank. Putting the head of the National Security Agency in the White House in charge of Latin America as a chairman of the Inter-American Development Bank is a sign of weakness. It's a very strong sign of weakness, a big sign. And I think everybody takes note of that. So I don't see much future in the Inter-American Development Bank's projects in Latin America. What I see is more future in Chinese lending. And there's a lot of money, a lot of Chinese money coming in, some of it through the Inter-American Development Bank, other parts through the Latin American Development Bank based in Caracas. We're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see a lot more of bilateral relationships, increased central bank agreements, swaps between the Chinese central bank and the South American central banks. We're going to see a lot more of that. The US will not be able to recover the space it's lost. It will continue losing it. The US has, strangely enough, what Trump did, and that's I think it's suicidal. What Trump did was say, remember we used to be the land of hope? We're no longer the land of hope. And that message has been taken in. That message has been taken in. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Oscar. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thanks for everybody. The audience has amazing patience. I'm going to be the last speaker. I've been charged with speaking about India, so I will try to keep this as brief as possible and then take other things up in questions and answers. So from the point of view of India, what does the US elections 2020 look like? Well, on the surface, the whole discussion is all about two different things. On the one hand, there is the Trump-Modi bromance, this whole sort of, two autocrats in love with each other sort of thing. And there's definitely large elements of truth with that, just as there is with Brazil's Bolsonaro. So there's definitely that. And on the other hand, of course, there is the another important but superficial aspect, but the kind of aspect that tends to get discussed a lot, which is the placement of an Afro-Indian woman as the vice presidential nominee for Kamala Harris, or Kamala Devi Harris, as she would be in India. So anyway, so there is all of this thing, and of course there is then and on the one hand, of course, there are the people who say that Biden may be better for India in some ways, etc. But even they are at least going to be mildly irritated by the fact that the Biden-Harris ticket will go back to the old practice of continuing the same effective policies as Trump and others, but at the same time taking the luxury of wagging their finger at India for alleged human rights violations and deficiencies of democracy, and so on. Now, mind you, I am as big a critic of the deficiencies of Indian democracy, particularly under the likes of Modi, etc. What I'm pointing to is the hypocrisy of the American position on this. Anyway, if we look at the most recent set of events, what we are seeing is, of course, as probably people have noted, there has been a very big increase in border tensions, and that are also being that are being given a global perspective, essentially because the Modi government is essentially tying this into its deepening relationship with the United States. I mean, basically, part of what I'm saying is that from the South Asian perspective, it's all about China and India. So there are increased China and the United States, a triangular relationship between India, China, US. In this, India is increasing border tensions with China. Of course, over the last many decades, well, 2 or 3 decades anyway, since the fall of the Soviet Union, India has been edging closer to the United States. And in the last week itself, we saw the signing of a new one of the last of 3 major agreements on defense and intelligence and security cooperation. There was also this was also supposed to hasten the delivery of some drones that the Indian Army would like to use in its confrontation with China. In recent years, and particularly over the last couple of years, there has been increasing cooperation with the Five Eyes grouping, which has now been thinking of adding Japan as well as India to itself. So this is basically the intelligence cooperation between the United States, Britain, Canada, United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And to this, China, India and Japan are being added. So there is that element. Further, India has stayed out of the Belt and Road Initiative, ostensibly to protect its sovereignty and to protect international norms and to resist China's influence in India's neighborhood, by which India basically means that it resents the deepening cooperation between China and Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan is another important element in this situation. And of course, India has joined and greatly encouraged the discussion of increasing defense cooperation between the United States, Australia, and Japan and India. So the so-called Quad. And the language that India is now increasingly subscribing to is essentially the Western imperialist language of openness. Essentially, what that means is that the whole world should open their economies up to predation by the capitalists of these countries, and the language of the alleged rules-based international order, by which it means the rules that are set by Western countries, which should be obeyed by all countries. So, as you can see, in recent times, there has been a lot of deepening of the relationship between India and the United States, and India has deliberately essentially made China as the group, as China as the group, China as the country against which India's foreign policy is directed. There is a lot of hype in the US-China relationship between how they are the 2 world's largest democracies. In reality, they are the two of the larger capitalist economies that are ruled by political classes that are most committed to a neoliberal and financialized capitalism. While there are some continuities between what the present leaders are doing and recent government from other parties, just as there are in the United States, there is actually a deep there's actually the role of the BJP, the present Hindu nationalist government, fascist government, really, I should say, in further antagonizing China, in doing the utmost to antagonize China. So I will end by simply saying that in the case of India and its present government, there are a couple of things that are involved in terms of the social basis. Basically, India's much larger capitalist class that has emerged over the last 2 or 3 decades, and on whose increasing power, the power of the BJP rides, it's sort of congenitally anti-communist, because the richer farmers who eventually became capitalist farmers and then capitalists in general, these were the groups that most intensely resisted the efforts of the Indian government to transfer resources from agriculture to industry to sustain planned industrialization. Instead of that, what these people have done is they thwarted the Indian government's attempts to do this in a planned, egalitarian, and productive way, and instead they themselves took their own resources from agriculture and became capitalists. So in a certain sense, the agrarian transition in India has taken a very capitalist form, and anti-communism is built into this because they equated Nehru's planned industrialization strategies and its implication for agriculture with communism, and this has been hated. And so from that time, and also the India's defeat in the 1962 territorial war with China has also been used as a stick with which to beat Congress. So basically, a Hindu nationalist government, a BJP government, as we have here, is essentially going to view the Biden administration as at least considerably less comfortable and more irritating. Having said that, I don't think the Biden administration is going to change its engagement, change the nature of the US engagement with India. It's going to continue with plans to essentially create a kind of Asian NATO, which is what the Quad is all about. So I will end there and open it up to questions. Thank you very much, audience, for your great patience, and also all the speakers. So I would like to invite questions now. Please use the raise hand function if possible. I'm going to go to what's the word, gallery view now, but I may still not be able to see you, so please raise hands in the screen. And of course the speakers are also welcome. I have Roger and then Paul and then Maria on my list, and if others want to speak, please raise your hand. Roger, please go ahead. Roger, you have to unmute yourself. I will try. Yeah, there you go. You're unmuted now. Please go ahead with your question.
Muted. Yeah.
That's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, Radhika and Alan, thank you very much for a fascinating conversation and bringing so many people from across the world to talk all together in one place. It's been fascinating and I have enjoyed it very much. My question is to Yash. Yash is an old friend of mine, and as usual, he is more, his arguments are clear and robust in a way which almost nobody else in the world can manage. And I'd like to take his number 2, the contraction and weakening of the United States, and his prediction that we are now moving into the region where we're looking at a new global war. And he related that to the 1940 to 1945 war, which was catastrophic. I'd like to ask Yash if he could expand on that discussion.
Go ahead, Yash. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Shall I answer straight away?
Yes, please.
Well, Roger, this is a word that we both know very well. You know Africa so well. You taught in Kenya and Tanzania. You and I have been to Pakistan recently also to look at the whole situation. Now, this new world is unfolding in front of our eyes. We don't quite know how it will evolve. I can say for now that China is a friend of Africa because all the evidence is there. But I can't say that it may not turn imperial. It has not happened. India and China have traded with Africa for 4,000 years. Neither of them colonized us. China had expanded, but it was territorial expansion, not beyond oceans. So, Roger, we are looking into a very new world, which we have not seen. And of course, the technology has improved enormously. And at the same time, technology is, as Marx said, force of production. But technology can also be used as a force for destruction. Unfortunately, under capitalism, these productive forces are used more for war than for peace and development. So I won't go on and on this because I think you and I are familiar with this. I just want to share this view with the bigger audience that I think we can look at the future more positively. And I think we can. I'm back in my own country in Uganda now, and I work in a small area called Karamoja, which has a lot of gold. And the exploitation of the women and children on gold is amazing. And I have gone from the global to the local, total, to the communal. because changes will have to begin from below, not from top. And that's what I'm going to devote the rest of my life. So Roger, you opened a door for me, and you and I will exchange more ideas on this. But I think we all should share that we are now, I won't call it a revolutionary situation, but we are in a situation of transformation. And that's maybe our intermediate step to for a bigger agenda that we have in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yash. Now, I think that you were right, Yash, to ask me whether you should go right away. So I think I'm going to take 2 questions at a time, and then I'll also invite any panelists who want to say something to do so, and then go to the next 2 questions. So the next 2 people I have are Paul Kellogg. Great to see you here, Paul, and Maria Victor. So Paul first, and then Maria, and then we'll take some answers.
Thanks very much, Radhika, and thanks for organizing the panel. Extremely interesting. So both Yash Tandon and Oscar Ugarteche and others are absolutely right, identifying Biden and Trump. Whoever gets elected will manage an imperialist power, and with all the dangers that that entails. It's absolutely right. However, I believe that the defeat of Trump and the election of Biden does matter a lot for the future of the world order. And I'd appreciate their comments or the comments of others on the following. Trump is crystallizing, and has been for some time, a white nationalist, neo-fascist movement in the United States, oriented on eliminating the rule of law, eliminating democratic checks on governance, and willing to enforce its will through racist violence, particularly directed against African American. And this has become extremely clear through his rule. It's not new in the United States. We've seen the KKK, we've seen George Wallace, etc., the movements around that. What is new is that he took over control of the second party in the United States, the Republican Party, and he took over control of the state, or the presidential wing of the state anyway, which is really serious. And African American masses understand this. White United States does not understand this, or only a minority do. African American masses, in their vast majority, understand this, and that's why they are the core element of the Democratic Party, something that does not make it into many discussions. 35% of its membership and dues, and activists come, in some states it's 2/3, are African American, in spite of there being just about 12% of the population. And that is why when Georgia turned against Trump and elected Biden, which they have done so, it has to be seen as a black-led electoral uprising against white nationalism and neo-fascism. And this matters internally, of course, because with 4 more years of Trump in the presidency, he consolidates his movement even more. It won't go away with him being defeated, but he consolidates it more. It matters externally for the world order. Just think about it. If there is a fascist turn in the United States, we know what happened when there was a fascist term in Germany internally in the 1930s. It actually became the issue of the world order. So I would appreciate comments on that from Oscar, Yash, or whoever else would like to comment out from the panels.
Okay, great, Paul. Thank you. Maria, you're next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. This is such a wonderful conversation we're all having, and I seem to agree with everyone. But taking the last point that Paul had just said, there is no doubt at all in my mind that the racism and the white supremacist emphasis on that Trump has had in the United States domestically spilled over into the right, also extreme right in Latin America. Just think of what those crazy people that overturned Evo Morales were doing and saying. And this emboldened this racist element of the white supremacist of many opposition groups in Latin America. But I also want to caution that it is true what Yash Tandon says, that of course both Biden and Trump have the same outlook up towards Latin America as the Americans have always had, and that is that we're their backyard. With respect to Venezuela, which I wanted to say and also ask a question, is that they want our oil and our gold, and the only way to get it is to destroy our government. And it isn't a regime change. It's a destruction of the state of Venezuela, just like they did with Yugoslavia. They want to cut it up. They want it, never again will there be, you know, the democracy that we have there, because they are desperate for the oil and the gold and the water. And I want to ask Professor Ross something. We also, like Yash Tandon has said, have seen the Chinese investment that has come with no conditions, no strings attached. The Chinese say, well, you have your domestic government. They've never said to President Maduro, do this, do that, to the other, like the United States always did. So this has been greatly, greatly appreciated in Venezuela. And the other thing that's been greatly appreciated in Venezuela was the sterling, exceptional help that China has given Venezuela during the pandemic, where I would like you all to know, Venezuela cannot buy medicine or food, even during this pandemic. So China, as well as Russia, as well as Turkey and Iran, have come and helped Venezuela. But Venezuela has not had any traditional relationships with China. China was on the other side of the world. And so now there is a great interest and I would say great gratification or gratitude to China. But my question to Professor Ross is the following. So what does the public in China think about Latin America? What are the opinions of the Chinese officials and the things that are published in China? What do they say, and what is their attitude towards Latin America? Is what I am saying reflected there, or is this a one-sided sort of friendship? I'd really love to know what Professor Ross thinks about that.
Great, Maria, thank you. So I don't particularly want to call on anybody. Speakers, maybe just speak up as you need to.
Radhika, I'd be happy to respond to Paul's question first.
That would be great, Dimitri, thank you.
So, Paul, I agree entirely with your assessment of Trump. And I certainly believe that the vast majority of African-American voters would agree with our assessment of Trump. I think that his rhetoric has emboldened the far right and white supremacists, and that the rhetoric of Biden will not do so, or at least not nearly to the same degree. But it's also interesting that in this election, Trump received a higher proportion of the African-American vote than he did in the prior election. He went from 6% of the African-American vote to 8%. And it may actually be higher than that when the final count is in. Why did this happen? Well, let's look at Biden's record. Biden, as is well known, was against busing. Biden was the author of the deeply racist 1994 crime bill. He bragged at the time about being the driving force behind that bill. The world watched his erratic stewardship of the Clarence Thomas hearings and his dubious treatment of Anita Hill. He chummed it up when he was climbing through the ranks of the Senate with white supremacists on the Judiciary Committee. So Joe Biden has a record which is rightly dealt with or treated with tremendous skepticism in the African-American community. And the only reason I think, or the main reason why he's gotten so much more support, or Biden's gotten so much more support from African-Americans than Trump did, is because Trump is even worse. And there was a very interesting interview done on American mainstream television a few weeks ago, where 3 African-American women were asked if they were going to vote for Biden, and they said, why should we? Of course, we understand that Trump is a disaster, but what has Biden done for the African-American community? And even his running mate, Kamala Harris, has a dubious record when it comes to treatment of African-Americans in the criminal justice system. So yes, Trump is a white supremacist, he's a fascist, he's a racist. His rhetoric is worse than that of any American president in our lifetimes. But in substance, is he that much better than Joe Biden, or that much worse? I really question whether he is based upon his record.
Thank you, Dimitri. Who are the other people who would like to respond to Paul and Maria's questions? I think one of them was for you, John.
Yes, I would like, yes.
Okay, so Claude and then John will respond, and then I will go to some other questions.
So I have no argument with what Paul said, but I think that we have to start from the global situation. I mean, we are living in an explosive world with structural seismic events. We don't know how the economic crisis will proceed, and it will absolutely determining to know how Biden will act. We don't know how geopolitical crisis in the world, going from Kazakhstan, India, Asia, Turkey, Mediterranean, Sub-Saharan region, we don't know how all of this will evolve, and we have to start from this starting point. One, the global economic crisis, to the geopolitical turmoil existing in the world. So I have no disagreement with the composition, the social composition of Biden electorate, but we have to take into account how the global situation will take its toll on domestic politics in the US, even in the superpower, and of course in Europe and elsewhere. That's all.
Great, thank you, Claude. John, please go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, John. John, please unmute yourself.
Right, okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Right, fine. Okay, on Maria's question. I'd like to give a very honest opinion. And just, I don't like to introduce statistics about myself, but just to indicate that I have some knowledge of what is the opinion in China. As I said, I've got more than 1 million followers on Weibo in China, and I'm the most published Western author on China on social media and internet. That's just, don't like to say such things, but it's just necessary to be factual, right? Okay. The reality is that China public does not know very much about Latin America, because it was regarded as the backyard of the United States. There is enormous support in China for Fidel Castro and Cuba. The only death of a foreign leader that was commemorated by Xi Jinping by visiting the embassy and paying the highest Chinese form of respect, which is to bow 3 times, was on the death of Fidel Castro. There was also some considerable interest, not as much as Fidel, who is extremely well known in China, during the Hugo Chavez period, because Chavez was seen as leading a successful struggle. Apart from that, to be quite honest, they don't know enough. And I certainly regard it as one of the most important things to do, to let people in China know about the situation in Latin America. It's also necessary, however, to know the style of China, which differs from that of Latin America. I remember very, very vividly a discussion I had with the Consul General of Venezuela in Shanghai. He said when China launched the first satellite for Venezuela, he said the Americans made every attempt to stop the launching of the satellite right up to the morning when the satellite was launched. China made no declarations. It made no statements, no hostility, but the satellite went up. And that is the Chinese style of doing matters. They understand perfectly well that the #1 target of the United States is China. And they have a very careful leadership on that. I would say the situation therefore is, as I said, Cuba is strongly supported within China. There is interest in Venezuela, particularly with the figure of Hugo Chavez, who was highly regarded. There is not yet enough knowledge about the situation in Latin America. And one of the things that can be done is to increase this knowledge. This is an area in which I'm a great supporter of China, but nevertheless, this is an area in which, in my opinion, things are not developed enough. just to switch slightly onto things, and therefore I want to do that. I had the great honor to meet President Chavez several times to discuss economic policy. And I think that there was some ultra-left discussion in Venezuela, in my honest opinion, that China had become a capitalist country, which I think was quite wrong. I know this existed because I knew the people involved in it. Unlike Fidel, who was always very clear that China remained a socialist country. Just on the points that Paul Kellogg made, just on a different thing. I think that there is not going to be any essential change in policy of Biden compared to Trump in relation to China, and except in tactics, no difference in fundamentals, or in regard to Latin America. But nevertheless, you have to take small advances forward. I think that the election of Biden will aid the formation of a left in the United States, because it will be seen that Biden will capitulate and will not be different. Whereas if Trump had been elected, then it would be the case that people would say, oh, well, we need to elect whoever is the Democratic Party. And I think Lenin was entirely right on such matters, that it was necessary to support Biden against Trump without having any illusions in Biden. I also agree very, very crucially with what Paul said. An absolutely important matter is the development of the black struggle in the United States, who understand they were subject to a completely direct racist assault by Trump. And what has happened in Georgia and other places, I think the black vote also in the northeast states of the United States is very important, despite the fact that there is not a substantial difference between Biden and Trump. I think it was very necessary to support Biden in this election. I mean, not support is perhaps a bit exaggerated word, to vote for Biden against Trump in this, because this aids the formation of a current in the United States, which is on the left. And there's a specific matter. Historical relations between the black population of the United States and China have always been very good. This weakened after 80, but some of the most important black American leaders were very closely related with China. W.B. Du Bois was a guest at China's National Day. The Black Panthers went to the United States. Muhammad Ali went to the United States. Malcolm X made many speeches in support of the United States. And I think building up the relations between China and Black America is very crucial.
Thank you, John. Are there any other people who want to respond to Paul and Maria's questions? Yash, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think some very important issues have been raised. Both Paul and Maria have raised this question of racism, which is extremely important. I don't know about United States very much, but I think the way George Floyd was killed not long ago, in my view, has changed the situation quite a lot in America, I think. Follower of Martin Luther King, and I think it has sparked the whole Black Lives Matter movement very strongly. And I say that because I can sense it in Africa also, because they have this sympathy with Afro-Americans.
Yes.
So I think we are possibly looking at some transformation there that might occur. Now the question is to whether Paul said that United States, the Trump is a neo-fascist. Well, my view is that fascism is not a personal thing, it's systemic. Hitler was a fascist, so was Churchill fascist. Capitalist system is fascist because it is also racist and fascist. And therefore, it's not a personal thing at all. I think we want not regime change in America. between these two people who are contesting. We want a systemic change, not regime change. That's the first point I want to make. Second point I want to make is that racism is a phenomenon that goes back to colonial period, even before that probably. And we still manifestation of that in Africa. And that again is because unless we bring about fundamental changes in the reality of ownership of our own means of production, it won't change. South Africa has been independent now for about 20 years. But practically nothing is owned by Africans. You go to Johannesburg, all those big buildings are owned by Old Mutual. You step outside Johannesburg, the farms are still owned by the whites. You go to mining areas, they are still owned by the whites. You go to banks, shipping, there is no change. Once again, it's a systemic thing, not personal. So I don't want to go too much into this, but Maria, I'm glad that you raised this question, and I think Johnson has answered your question very well already. But you raised a very important question, and I think we are now, in my view, we are facing a global shift, geopolitical shift, and I think that is a good thing. And China is a major factor in that. It may have problems too, but China is a factor in that. And I think Africa will come forward, Latin America will come forward. I think after example set by Castro and Venezuela, I think Latin America is doing better than Africa. At least there is resistance there. In Africa, still there is not resistance. So I will wind up there and saying that I look more positively at how things are moving in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, Yash, thank you. I have two more people. Maybe actually I will take three. So I have John Riddell, Anders Ekelund, and Brendan Devlin in that order. John Riddell, would you like to go?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for this wonderful session today. I took part last week in the formation of a cross-Canada initiative committee against Canada's Cold War on China. And the issue which we have seized is demanding the liberation of Meng Wanzhou, the top executive of Huawei, who has been illegally detained in Canada for 2 years. Of particular interest in this was the participation of two representatives of members of Canadian Chinese organizations. And I noted that one of their motivating issues in trying to link up with the case of Meng was that they feel, and particularly since the pandemic, a strong racism against Chinese Canadians, which is being escalated by Canada's diplomatic efforts against China. So having said that, my question is, I would be very interested in hearing now, or perhaps by email, and I did put my email on the chat line, about any similar initiatives in other countries. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. So that was more a statement. Yeah, next I have Anders, and then I have Brendan.
Hello, everybody. I will follow up on Paul Kellogg and Ross. And the topic is the building of a US left. Because over the last, it's almost 40 years, it's always been a mystery to me why the American left did not call for electoral reform. I mean, from a Nordic perspective, universal suffrage, female suffrage, that was always key demands. And you know, the impossibility of building an independent Labour Party when you are stuck into an archaic electoral system which basically just allows two parties, which is so rigged against any initiative, you are really sort of locked down almost forever. How should you build a pole of attraction when it cannot show up on the national electoral scene? I will not give you any details about the situation in the Nordic country. I see Göran Terborn, my Swedish friend, is with us. But and if you take an aside, if you look at Corbyn now being suspended, maybe excluded from the Labour Party, how are you able to build up electoral support if you have a sort of a non-proportional electoral system, which is also very archaic? So I think this really has to be on the left agenda. It's very easy to blame them and point to how close Biden is to Trump, and there are, of course, several important differences, but we have to, before we accuse them, we have to look at ourselves. And I think this is a major weakness, both of the US left and especially the UK left, which I know much better, which are sort of secretly supporting this awful two-party system in the UK. So let me throw this torchlight into the debate.
Okay, thank you, Anders. And Brendan.
Hi, everyone. So I have my own question, but I do also have a couple questions that were collected over the course of the session from the chat. So I don't know if I should maybe start with those
Yes,
ones.
please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. So there are two questions from the chat, both directed towards Oleg Grabanov, but I'm sure we'd like anyone else's input as well. So the first question came from Harris, which in response to your presentation, Oleg, was simply, what about left people in Russia? And the second question came from Alan Freeman, and the question was, can you explain the rationale for official support for Trump? It seems irrational given that under Trump, Russia is under siege on all sides, its key allies such as Iran especially. So we'd like to know a bit more about the motivation for that.
Great. And Brendan, do you also want to put your own question?
Sure. So my question was particularly for John Ross, but again, like anyone else's input, you mentioned that you agreed with Steve Bannon, which I must say was not something I expected to hear on this panel. But I take your point that the U.S. has only about 5 years to stop this rise of China. So I guess I wonder though, how realistic is it even within those 5 years of stopping it? How much of a chance is there in these next few years even? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. So I'm going to take in order Oleg, then John, and then whoever wants to respond to Anders's kind of broader question. Oleg.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. Harris, first of all, the mainstream Communist Party of the Russian Federation, their approach was more or less similar to the Kremlin. In that sense, there were no much difference. But if we take into account some independent left intellectuals, left experts in Russia, there was a rather interesting point that I read that it would be in favor of the U.S. left, of the U.S. progressive forces, that Biden would not win and would lose at these elections. Because there is a danger that more or less that Dimitri Lascaris, the point that Dimitri Lascaris has raised now, that Biden could harden the pro-liberal mainstream approach and block the progressive left ideas within the Democratic Party, like the ideas of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some others. And also, still there is much positive view in Russia, not only in the left, but in general, towards Bernie Sanders. Because Bernie was considered as a normal old socialist, sorry for this term, as an old normal socialist. He was very well understood by people with Soviet heritage, with Soviet education. In that sense, he was much more understandable for the old generations of the Russian left than the new progressive forces within the Democratic Party, like Ocasio-Cortez and some others. And now to Alan's questions. Yes, it's irrational, but still there was a logic. I mean the Kremlin, we had a very close relations with Trump before his campaign in 2016. We had some relations with him. We had some promises from him. I don't want to insist whether was the Russian interference into those elections or no, but in fact, there was maybe illusion, and there is maybe illusion, that during his first term, Trump was under pressure from the Democratic Congress, from the mainstream in his own party, and so he became anti-Russian by force, not by will. And in that sense, there was maybe illusion that in his second term, Trump could be more free to express his willingness to cooperate with Vladimir Putin. And another irrational point, but that is quite important if we take into account Vladimir Putin's psychology, that Trump is made of the same blood and flesh that Vladimir Putin is. So he feels himself quite easily to speak with Trump. They communicate on the same tonality, on the same nuances. So in that sense, there was quite irrational, I agree with you, but still a quasi-total pro-Trump approach. Thank you.
Okay, and I think it was John who was next.
Yeah, what Oleg said was very interesting to know that there was support for Bernie Sanders in Russia, because I'm afraid that RT, which I've written for, has made very big mistakes in the last period over its analysis of the situation in the United States. It's been persistently carrying attacks on the Black Lives Matter movement. It has been carrying attacks on real protection against the pandemic, and frankly, I would think it is rather discredited itself in the United States and limited its influence. I would say, in particular, for example, for the Black movement in the United States, the historic link of the Black movement in the United States is with China. But nevertheless, I'm sure that the Black leaders in the United States who oppose the Cold War against China will equally oppose any Cold War against Russia. So I really think, I'm afraid that, so I don't know the situation with the Kremlin, but I think RT has made very considerable mistakes in the last period. Finally, just come on to other things on the question of China, I think one has to take into account that the Chinese leadership is really rather objective and skillful about the present situation. And again, I want to stress, if I believed that China was making big mistakes, I would not necessarily express it here. I would convey it privately, because there's ways to do that. So I'll just shut up about it. I actually think that China's response is rather skillful to the attack by the United States, and I think that the next 5-year plan is very good. This is very important from the point of view of relations with Latin America, because it wants to maintain relations. It does, I say, it has a different style. The Hugo Chavez is at the UN sitting there and saying, you know, the devil has been in the street, in the chair before me, is not China's style, but let's leave that aside. Right, okay, it deals with the matter very objectively. I know that China is very concerned to maintain very good relations with Russia. And the good thing to know is that economic relations between China and Russia are greatly improving, because it was for a certain period that relations between the militaries and relations with foreign policy were very good, but unfortunately there were not enough economic links. Now there is not merely the question of the export of Russian gas to China, but also the question of Huawei is becoming very involved in Russian high technology. So therefore I think that, and I think that the leadership of China on this matter is really rather skillful. That's the point I would make on that.
Great, thanks. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to the two questions raised by Anders and Brendan? Okay, if there aren't, then I'm going to go to the last batch of questions, and I'm going to put everybody in there, and then we will. I would like to end by 3 hours. I think it is amazing that we have such a marathon resilience, but I think we should end at 3 hours. So I have John, I have Claude Cerfati, and then I would like to say a few things. And then we will have a few responses and then try and end. So John, please go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yes, I muted you earlier. So please unmute yourself.
Oh, if my hand is up, it's a mistake. I've finished what I
Oh,
had.
okay, great. So Claude, please go ahead. You are still muted. Claude, you are muted.
Yes, sorry, I did not hear on what I would speak.
No, I thought you had a question because I saw
No,
your
no,
hand.
no. It was a mistake. Sorry.
Well, great. All right, then we will definitely end on time in that case. So I just wanted to say generally that I feel that we've had a very good discussions, and one of the very strong impressions I was left with is that in some ways I think has happened in periods of great change. I think it seems as though political trends are crossing borders. You have sort of Trump and Trump-like formations in different parts of the world, whether it's in India and Brazil or parts of Eastern Europe, but at the same time, you also have the same sort of kind of a progressive social liberal, but otherwise neoliberal a trend which is represented by the American Democratic Party and so on. And this takes us back to Michael's sort of graphic portrayal of the sorts of political forces which are absent. You have essentially extreme right forces, you have a neoliberal, social liberal, but otherwise also quite repressive forces, but there is an absence of the left. There's also the interesting question which touches on what so many people said. I mean, it's really, right now we are going to look at a contest between, on the one hand, probably increasingly desperately aggressive American postures on the international level, and on the other hand, China's relatively calm, measured exercise of its economic magnetism around the world, which will actually, essentially, it will not answer brick with brick, but it will actually answer the various American and allied provocations in a very, very different way. And I think we're going to be looking at that. We've had loads of discussions about the continuity and the discontinuity between Biden and Trump. And I think it's all very thought-provoking, and particularly on the issue of, what difference does it make? There are certainly a substantial number of us who said that it made a difference and many others who didn't. But I think we probably all agree that there is a difference. In terms of foreign policy, it may not amount to much. The real issue is whether that difference is substantial enough even for the American population. And I think the policy differences may also be, well, there are two things here. The policy differences may be dissolved in a certain sense by the reduced American ability to act both on the domestic front and on the international front, thanks to its own economy spiraling out of control and politics spiraling out of control. And the second question is whether a left will emerge more easily with Biden as president. And I'm reading here that CNN has just declared Biden as president. But anyway, I'm sure Trump will have a lot to say about this still. So, but anyway, the question is whether a left will develop more easily under the Biden dispensation, or would have developed more easily under a Trump dispensation. This is also something we will have to wait and see. I'm not clear that there is. I mean, I'm enticed by both arguments, but I'm not clear I can easily settle the matter. I also think many people pointed out that the pandemic is going to be a great sifter of countries, separating out those countries that are capable of, or that are or will be successful against the pandemic, and those which will lurch from lockdown and economic damage to lockdown and economic damage. So this is going to be really interesting, because I've certainly taken the view in my own writing that if the neoliberal Western countries actually want to tackle the pandemic, they will have to take such a different approach to public health that it will negate what they have been doing for the last 40 years. And if they actually do it in the realm of public health, then the question will arise, why do they not do similar things? Essentially take a social, non-corporate, public approach to matters, why they are not doing it in other spheres of life, which will then put a fundamental wrench into the future of capitalism. Yeah, I think that for the rest, I mean, third world countries are going to essentially experience the United States as having even fewer attractions than it has done over the last 50 to 70 years. So I just thought I would sort of resume some of those issues, because I think that it's been a very rich discussion, and I think it's productive of many more discussions. So I hope that, I hope that people will join us. I will end here for now, but I will end by asking if anybody would like to say anything before we close. We have a few more minutes. Yeah. Anyone like to add anything? Okay, folks, I
We
think.
have to thank you, Radhika. We have to thank you for all your attempts. This was really very great.
Well, thank you. I'm certainly having fun.
All these people together, yeah, really, it was a great discussion, and we should continue. And for me, at least, it helped a lot, because all the time hearing just Western and German television and so on, it's really boring. It's nothing. Yeah, so really, I learned a lot, and I hope to see all of you again. Yeah, and best greetings by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation too.
Well, thank you.
Agree with
Sorry,
Michael.
Dimitri, you
Thank
want to
you.
say? Okay,
Thanks,
well,
everybody.
Thanks.
It was great.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Later.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.